Give me the bag. The little ones. Her inhaler's in there. Please. She needs it. Punch me. Come on. Show everybody who you really are.
5 of them had drifted into Cedar Hollow Park like they owned the grass under their feet. Because for most of their lives, in one way or another, they had. Brett Holloway had learned from his father that a man with enough money never truly loses. He simply outlasts everyone who mistakes him for beatable. And the man he'd chosen to break that afternoon looked like the safest possible target. A mechanic. A widower. A single father in a faded denim jacket who rebuilt transmissions on the east side of town and had never, as far as anyone in Cedar Hollow knew, raised his voice to a living soul. Brett had surrounded him in broad daylight. He'd taken the man's 8-year-old daughter's backpack. He'd watched her chest begin to tighten and her breath begin to whistle. And he'd watched the father just stand there. Still, quiet, saying almost nothing while his little girl fought for air. Brett read that stillness as fear. He read it as surrender. But here is the question worth staying for. What happens when the quietest man in the park has already survived things Brett Holloway couldn't imagine on his best day? What happens when the target you've spent weeks poking turns out to be the one thing your father's money was never able to buy? A man who genuinely does not care what you can do to him, only what you are about to do to his child. If you're the kind of person who stays for stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who get pushed exactly 1 inch too far, do me a favor and subscribe. Then tap the bell so the next one finds you. We track these down every single week. And believe me, this one is only getting started. His name was Marcus Reed, and for 3 years, Tuesday afternoons had belonged to his daughter. The ritual never changed. 2 granola bars, a thermos of black coffee, and a small dented notebook. All packed into the same canvas bag before he walked Zoe down to Cedar Hollow Park after school. It had begun as a simple way to get her outside, to get fresh air into her lungs after long days trapped in a classroom. Somewhere along the way, it had quietly become the steadiest thing either of them owned. Zoe would crouch at the edge of the pond with a pair of second-hand binoculars, keeping a running census of every duck that returned each week, and Marcus would sit on the bench a few feet back and watch her the way some people watch a sunset, like they already know it won't hold, so they are trying to press every second of it into memory. Marcus was not a man who talked about himself. At the garage on Fowler Street, the other mechanics knew him as the one who stayed late without being asked, who never called out sick, who kept a laminated photo of his daughter taped inside the lid of his toolbox. They knew he was raising her alone. They knew his wife had died when Zoe was 3. A wet highway, a 2-lane road, a truck that wandered across the yellow line at the worst possible moment. Beyond those bare facts, Marcus never offered more, and the men he worked beside had the good sense not to reach for it. Some people carry their grief the way they carry an old injury, silently, daily, without ever expecting anyone to ask where it hurts. What none of them knew, what nobody in the whole quiet town of Cedar Hollow knew, was that Marcus Reed had once been somebody else entirely. Not dangerous the way people assume a large, silent man might be dangerous. Dangerous the way a locked door is dangerous, because of what waits, patient and unbothered, on the other side of it. In the years before Zoe was born, before Nicole, before the garage and the granola bars and the Tuesday afternoons that structured his whole quiet life, Marcus Reed had fought professionally under a name the announcers used to draw out slowly into the microphone: the Silent Current. 29 wins and 2 losses across regional welterweight competition. He had never been the kind of fighter who won by battering people into the canvas. His coaches used to say he could read a man's body the way a fluent reader takes in a sentence, that he knew what was coming before his opponent had finished deciding to throw it. When he controlled another human being, he did it without a trace of rage. That was what made him nearly impossible to beat, and it was also what made walking away from the sport feel so effortless when the time finally came. Marcus had never needed the violence. He had only ever needed the discipline underneath it. After Nicole died, he packed his championship belt, his worn gloves, and every yellowed newspaper clipping into an old military footlocker and carried it down to the basement. He didn't throw a single piece of it away. He simply lowered the lid, latched it, and did not open it again. Zoe knew, in the vague way children know things about their parents' earlier lives, that her father had done some kind of fighting when he was young. She had never pushed for more than that outline, and Marcus had never offered to fill it in. Some things, he had decided, belonged to a version of himself that no longer needed to walk around in the world. What existed now was a man who tucked a spare inhaler into his jacket pocket every single time he took his daughter anywhere. Because Zoe had developed asthma at 6, and the attacks could arrive fast and without any warning at all. What existed now was a man who had taught himself to braid hair from a video at 2 in the morning, because Zoe had asked him once, shy about it, whether he could make hers look like the girls at school. What existed now was a father who reshuffled his shifts at the garage every week so he could be the one waiting outside her school at the final bell, who read her science homework aloud with her at the kitchen table, who let her talk about migratory waterfowl for half an hour without once glancing at his phone. Cedar Hollow Park was the place where all of that felt most real, because a piece of Nicole still lived there. The community garden on the far side of the pond still had her name on a small wooden marker near the climbing roses. She had helped turn that soil and set those bushes the spring before the accident, her hands in the dirt, laughing about how she'd never grown anything alive in her life. Marcus walked past that marker slowly every week and never stopped, and Zoe had learned, without ever being told, not to point it out. The pond, the oak trees, the winding gravel path around the water, all of it had become something more than a park. It was the closest thing the two of them had to a place where Nicole still existed in the present tense. So when Marcus first heard that a developer named Preston Holloway intended to bulldoze most of Cedar Hollow Park to raise a block of luxury condominiums, he went home that night, sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long while, and then opened his laptop. He was not a man who went to city council meetings. He was not the kind of person who circulated petitions or planted himself in the middle of public fights. But he typed up a single clean page explaining exactly what the plan would erase, printed a stack of copies, and the next morning left one at every storefront on Main Street with a handwritten note asking people to sign if they wanted the park to remain. Within 6 weeks, he had gathered more than 700 signatures. Within 8, he had filed a formal objection with the county, citing contradictions buried inside Holloway Development's own environmental impact report. Preston Holloway noticed, and Brett Holloway, who had spent his entire life watching his father notice inconvenient people and then make them disappear, decided this particular problem was one he would prefer to handle personally, up close, in the open, where a mechanic could be taught what it cost to forget his place. The first time Brett's group showed up while Marcus and Zoe were at the park, Marcus told himself it was coincidence. 5 young men in their early 20s, loud, moving toward the pond in matching training giz like they'd wandered over from a tournament and hadn't finished burning off the energy. Brett was the easiest to pick out, not because Marcus had ever met him, but because he moved through open space the way people do when nobody has ever once told them to stop. He knocked an empty can off the end of a bench with his elbow and didn't glance down to see where it landed. He said something to the others, pitched at exactly the volume designed to be overheard by everyone within 30 feet. When one of them started flicking stones into the water near the ducks, Zoe looked up from her notebook and said quietly that they were going to scare the birds off. She wasn't rude about it. She was 8 years old, and she had spent 3 weeks charting which species were nesting on the far bank, and she said it the way a child says something true before anyone has taught her that some adults don't care about true things. Brett walked over and picked her notebook up off the bench where she'd set it beside her. He held it open for a moment, tilting his head like he was reading, and then he dropped it into the mud at the water's edge. Marcus was on his feet before it landed. He crossed the grass at a pace that was unhurried, but absolute, and he stopped close enough that Brett had to lift his chin a degree to hold his eyes. Marcus said, plainly and without any heat at all, that he would like Brett to step away from his daughter. Brett looked back at him with the particular smile people wear when they are deciding in real time how much trouble they feel like causing. "You gonna make me?" Brett said. Then, louder, playing to the others, "What are you gonna do, hit me in front of your kid?" Marcus bent and lifted the notebook out of the mud. He wiped the cover against his sleeve, thumbed through the pages to make sure the writing had survived, and handed it back to Zoe. He told her they were leaving. She took it and followed him without a word, looking back only once. Before they reached the path, Brett walked over to the campaign sign Marcus had staked near the garden fence and kicked the post until it leaned and toppled. He aimed his voice at Marcus's back with the laziness of someone certain the other man is still listening. "You can't save this park," he called. "You couldn't save anything that mattered." Marcus kept walking. He did not turn around. But the words reached him the way cold water finds an open wound, not because they were true, but because they landed on the exact spot he had never fully stopped pressing on himself. Nicole's accident, the two-lane road, the phone that rang at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. The thing about grief is that it does not need to make sense in order to level you. Marcus knew, in the front of his mind, every single day, that there was nothing he could have done. But knowing a thing and feeling a thing are two different countries, and some nights he still woke up living in the wrong one. That evening, after Zoe was asleep, Marcus opened a fresh notebook of his own and began writing everything down. Dates, times, what was said, and by whom. The names he recognized, and quick descriptions of the faces he didn't. He was methodical about it. The way he was methodical about everything. Not emotional, just thorough. The next morning, he carried his notes to the Cedar Hollow police station and filed a report. The officer behind the desk was polite in the particular way that told Marcus he already knew exactly whose son Brett Holloway was. He said there wasn't enough there to act on. He suggested mildly that Marcus try to avoid further contact. Marcus went home and kept the notebook. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in ways calibrated to be just deniable enough. Both front tires of his truck were flat on a Monday morning. Something obscene appeared spray painted across the garden's entrance sign overnight. Marcus photographed it, reported it, and scrubbed it off himself before Zoe could see. Then a customer mentioned, casually, that he'd noticed someone taking photographs of a little girl outside the elementary school. And something in Marcus's chest shifted that hadn't moved in years. Not fear, exactly, a version of it with teeth. He was still turning that over when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, male, unhurried, almost gentle. It told him that if he withdrew the petition, all of it would stop. It told him that men in his position, single fathers, hourly workers, people without lawyers on retainer, sometimes made the mistake of believing they were protected by the same rules as everyone else. Then the line went dead. The meeting with Preston Holloway happened 3 days later, in the parking lot outside City Hall, on the afternoon following the council session where Marcus had presented his 700 signatures. Preston was a tall man with a posture that comes from decades of having other people anticipate his wants before he had to name them. He shook Marcus's hand with just enough grip to make it a statement rather than a greeting, and then laid out his offer in the tone of a man doing someone a considerable favor. He said he would clear the remaining loan on the garage. He said he would set up an education fund for Zoe, a real one, the kind that opened doors. He said there were better neighborhoods, better schools, better opportunities, all of which could be arranged quietly and quickly, provided Marcus understood that the petition had simply run its natural course. Marcus listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said no. Preston's face didn't change the way most faces change when they hear something unwelcome. It simply went still, the way a room goes still in the seconds before weather arrives. He told Marcus, gently, almost kindly, that a man raising a child alone couldn't afford to make enemies he didn't fully understand. He said it like advice. One mistake, Preston said, and you could lose a great deal more than a park, within 48 hours. An anonymous report landed on the desk of the county's Child Protective Services office. It claimed that Marcus had a volatile temper and a documented history of violence, and that his daughter was being raised in an environment of fear. Around the same time, a rumor began circulating among the parents at Zoe's school. Marcus heard it third hand, that the quiet man from the garage had once done time for assault. He sat alone at the kitchen table with all of it for a full evening. Then he made a phone call. The number hadn't changed in 11 years. It rang 4 times before a man named Ezra Coleman picked up, and there it was. The same low, unhurried voice Marcus remembered from the years when Ezra had trained him 6 days a week in a converted warehouse outside the city. Marcus told him what was happening. Not all of it, but enough. Ezra was quiet for a moment after Marcus finished. "I need you to hear something," he said. "You're not walking into that park to win a fight. You're walking in to bring your daughter home safe. That's the only thing that counts once you get there." They made arrangements. Ezra drove out that weekend, and the two of them spent a Saturday in Marcus's garage, not training in any dramatic sense, but preparing. Ezra helped him rig a small camera into the lining of his jacket, paired with a backup audio recorder that would push its files to a cloud server automatically every 15 minutes. They walked through exit routes. They walked through scenarios. They walked through the specific techniques designed to control a person without leaving a lasting mark on him. Before Ezra left, Marcus wrote 3 sentences on a slip of paper and set it on the kitchen counter where he'd see it every morning. "Protect Zoe. Don't retaliate. Use only what is necessary." He treated those lines less like rules and more like a reminder of who he was trying to remain, for the moment when things got hard enough to make an ordinary man forget himself. Brett Holloway was not stupid. That was precisely what made him dangerous. He had watched Marcus walk away from every provocation without so much as a flinch, and he understood that a man like that couldn't be handled with a simple confrontation. You couldn't bait him into swinging first by insulting him. You couldn't rattle him by crowding his space. Marcus Reed had a quality Brett recognized and resented in equal measure. The quality of a man who has already decided, in advance and without theater, exactly how far he is willing to go. So Brett stopped aiming at Marcus, and he started aiming at the one thing Marcus could never walk away from. It began with small things, the kind that leave no fingerprints. Zoe's walk home from school was only 4 blocks, and on the days Marcus had appointments stacked back to back at the garage, she walked it alone. One afternoon, she told her father that a car had rolled slowly alongside her for nearly the whole length of Birchwood Street, matching her pace, staying just behind her shoulder, until she turned onto their block. She didn't recognize it. She said she hadn't looked at it directly, because something told her not to. Marcus listened, nodded once, and called the school the next morning to arrange a different pickup. He didn't tell Zoe why. He added the date and a description to his notebook and said nothing more about it. The bird feeder Zoe had built herself, balsa wood painted blue and yellow, a birthday gift she'd made for herself and mounted on a post near the garden, was found snapped clean in half one Tuesday when they arrived. She stood in front of it for a moment, holding the 2 broken pieces, and then she set them down carefully at the base of the post, as though they might still be good for something. She didn't cry. She was 8, and she had already learned that some things that break don't come back, so there wasn't much point in crying over wood. But that night she asked her father quietly whether they could go somewhere else next Tuesday. Somewhere that wasn't the park. Marcus said they'd talk about it in the morning. Then came the poster. Zoe had mounted a board near the community garden, her school project, with her species counts and migration notes lettered out in careful marker. Someone had taken a thick black pen to it and drawn over the whole thing. Marcus took it down before she could see what had been drawn, and he did not describe it to her. That same week, an anonymous account sent Zoe a video. Just footage of the pond at night, silent and dark, with a red circle drawn digitally around the oak tree where her wildlife camera was mounted. She showed it to Marcus without a word. He looked at it twice, set the phone face down on the counter, and asked her to go finish her homework. His expression didn't shift in any way she could read, which, over 8 years, she had learned to recognize as the look he wore when he was working very hard at something on the inside. The next morning, she found a rubber duck, painted entirely red, sitting on the grass directly beneath her camera, turned to face the lens. Marcus removed it without touching it with his bare hands, sealed it in a plastic bag, and added it to the folder growing on the high shelf in the hall closet. Photographs, timestamps, the anonymous CP's report, the letter from the police department, all of it sleeved in clear plastic and by then, thick enough that it needed a binder clip to stay shut. Zoe started waking in the middle of the night. She didn't always come to his room. Sometimes he'd hear her moving around and find her at the kitchen table with the light on, drawing birds in her sketchbook, because she said it helped her brain slow down. She told him once, in that particular 4 a.m. honesty that children sometimes have, that she kept dreaming she came home from school and he wasn't there, and she didn't know where he had gone. Marcus sat down across from her and told her that was never going to happen. Zoe looked at him steadily for a long moment, said she knew, and went back to her drawing. He came genuinely close to stepping back from the petition. Not because of what it might cost him, but because his daughter's sense of safety was eroding in ways a stack of signatures could never repair. The decision turned on a Thursday evening. Zoe was supposed to be upstairs reading, and Marcus was at the kitchen table going over the council agenda when she appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. From her face, he understood she'd overheard the call he'd taken 20 minutes earlier. A call from someone at the council office who'd mentioned, in passing, that Preston Holloway had already ordered excavation equipment on standby for the morning after the final vote. Zoe had heard enough. She stood there and said, with the kind of steadiness that sometimes surfaces in small people who have already lost something enormous, that if they left because they were scared, then other kids would have to leave too. Marcus looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he closed the agenda, and he closed the withdrawal letter he'd been drafting, and he told her to go to bed. Brett had chosen the following Tuesday on purpose. The park would have its usual mid-afternoon foot traffic, enough witnesses to generate pressure, not so many that the group couldn't manage the perimeter. He'd walked the others through it the night before. Travis and Evan would stay near the path with their phones already rolling. Cole would slide between Marcus and Zoe the instant things started. Noah would fall in behind Marcus to block the rear. And Brett would be sitting on the bench nearest the pond like a man with absolutely nothing on his mind. The plan was simple, because simple things are harder to misread under pressure. Brett laid it out for the group the way his father laid out business decisions, not with excitement, but with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided the outcome and is merely arranging the pieces around it. Marcus and Zoe arrived at their usual time, just past 3:30. Zoe had her notebook. Marcus had his canvas bag. He'd checked the jacket camera that morning and confirmed the audio was uploading. And before he'd left the house, he had read the 3 sentences on the counter one more time, not because he'd forgotten them, but because repetition is a form of commitment. The 5 of them were already there. Brett took the backpack off Zoe's shoulder in one fluid motion, fast and easy, like he'd simply reached out to catch something falling. Zoe made a sound that was half surprise and half the beginning of panic, and she reached for the bag, and Brett tossed it sideways to Cole without looking. Cole unzipped it, reached in, and held up the blue inhaler like he was examining something mildly interesting. Marcus had both hands up immediately. Open palms, visible, deliberate, and he told them in a voice stripped completely of anger that his daughter needed that inhaler and that he needed them to hand it back right now. Zoe's breathing was already audible. That sound was the most frightening thing in the entire park. Brett stepped in and shoved Marcus hard into the slats of the bench. Marcus absorbed the impact and stayed upright, and he called out to a woman on the path, asking her to please call 911. Brett moved closer, close enough that Marcus could see the flush rising at his collar, the flush of a man enjoying himself, and said with a kind of flat amusement that Marcus should go ahead and hit him. Show everyone what kind of father he really was. Marcus tried to move toward Zoe. The others closed the gap. Then Brett threw the first punch. What happened next took less than 60 seconds, though the people who witnessed it would later describe it in terms that made it sound like something much longer. Marcus didn't answer the punch with a punch. He redirected Brett's swing by catching the wrist mid-arc, applied downward pressure to the joint, and brought Brett to one knee without a single strike. When Cole charged from the left, Marcus used the young man's own momentum to turn him and put him face first into the grass. And as Cole went down, the blue inhaler skidded out of his hand and came to rest on the lawn a few feet away. Travis came from behind with both arms outstretched. Marcus caught one, locked the elbow, and held him folded at the waist until he stopped pulling. Evan had picked up a length of metal edging from the garden border. Marcus kicked it out of his grip with the inside of his foot and set a flat hand against his chest until he sat back down against the bench. Then Marcus looked directly at Noah, who was standing very still near the path holding the backpack, and he said one word. Down, Noah set the bag on the ground. It was over. Not one closed fist from Marcus. Not one strike. Every person on the ground had put himself there through his own forward motion, and Marcus had simply been the surface each of them met when he arrived. He crossed the grass to where the inhaler had fallen, picked it up, and crouched beside Zoe, holding it steady while she breathed through the attack, one hand flat on her back, counting under his breath. Brett was still on the ground when he looked up and asked, with something that sounded almost like genuine confusion, who Marcus even was. Marcus didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on his daughter, his hand moving slowly across her shoulders, and said that he was her father. The clips bystanders posted spread fast enough that local news had picked them up by the next morning. By evening, national outlets were running it. For roughly 18 hours, strangers across the country described Marcus Reed as a hero. Preston Holloway had spent far longer than 18 hours dismantling problems more complicated than a bad news cycle, and he moved with the efficiency of a man who keeps certain phone numbers in his personal contacts for exactly this kind of afternoon. By the second day, a different video was circulating. This one began at the precise instant Marcus locked Brett's wrist. No backpack, no inhaler. No small girl fighting for air in the background. Just a trained fighter methodically taking down 5 young men who, in that isolated and context-free clip, appeared to have been doing nothing more than standing in a park. Brett surfaced at a press conference wearing a cervical collar. Travis arrived with his left forearm wrapped. Cole delivered a short, halting statement about psychological trauma. And Preston stood at the podium with the measured gravity of a man describing an injustice he personally found painful, and told the assembled cameras that his son and 4 friends had been violently assaulted by a professional fighter with documented expertise in submission holds and combat technique. He used the word unprovoked twice. The story flipped overnight. The garage called that afternoon and told Marcus not to come in until further notice. A temporary restraining order was served at his door the next morning, barring him from approaching Brett Holloway or coming anywhere near Cedar Hollow Park, and Child Protective Services opened an emergency review. The same office that had received the anonymous complaint weeks earlier, now armed with the edited footage, Marcus's competitive record, and a formal declaration that he had deliberately placed his own daughter in the center of a violent confrontation. The custody hearing was set for 9 in the morning, 3 days out. On the second evening, Marcus came home to a house that was quiet in a way it had never been. Zoe had been placed temporarily with her aunt across town while the review was active. Her cereal bowl was still in the drying rack from that morning. A hair tie was looped around the faucet handle where she always left it. The light in her room was on because he had forgotten to turn it off. And from the hallway it looked exactly the way it always looked when she was inside it, warm and cluttered and full of the particular energy of a child who fills a space simply by existing in it. He stood in her doorway for a while. Then he went to the kitchen and sat down. Preston's attorney called the next morning with a structured offer. Plead guilty to 1 count of assault. Accept 3 years of supervised probation. Withdraw the petition and sign a document agreeing not to pursue any legal action against the Holloway family. In exchange, Preston would personally recommend to CPs that Zoe be returned to her father's care. Marcus's own attorney, a careful woman named Dana Vale, who had taken the case on a limited retainer, told him plainly that given his fighting record and the video as currently edited, A jury trial carried real risk. She said it gently and honestly, which he appreciated, even as it made the room feel smaller around him. He was considering it, not because he believed he'd done anything wrong, but because the entire calculation had collapsed down to a single variable: getting his daughter home. The supervised visit took place in a beige conference room at the CP's office, a caseworker seated near the window. Zoe came in wearing her school clothes, sat across from him, and looked at him the way she always did when she was trying to work out something the adults weren't saying out loud. After a short silence, she asked him whether he had fought those people because he was angry. Marcus told her he had only done what it took to reach her, nothing more than that. Zoe sat with the answer for a moment. Then something moved across her face. Not quite a memory, more like a wire connecting two things that had been stored in separate rooms. And she asked her father whether the duck camera was still in the tree. The wildlife camera. The one mounted on the oak across from the bench. The one that saved directly to a memory card and hadn't been touched since before any of this began. Nobody had thought about it, because nobody knew it was there. It wasn't linked to a phone. It wasn't in the police report. It wasn't anywhere in Preston Holloway's careful calculation. After the visit ended, Zoe found her aunt in the lobby and told her, quietly, that the duck camera had seen everything. The park had already been fenced off for pre-construction access, and Marcus was legally forbidden from setting foot near it. The hearing was less than 12 hours away. That evening, Zoe's aunt reached Ezra Coleman through the number Marcus had left in her phone for emergencies, and Ezra called Dana Vale before 9. Dana filed for an emergency evidentiary retrieval order, arguing that potential exculpatory evidence sat at imminent risk of destruction by scheduled construction. A judge signed it at 11:40 at night. Ezra and Dana were standing at the park fence before 5 in the morning, well ahead of the excavation crew's 6 o'clock start. The memory card was still in the camera, exactly where Zoe had left it. The hearing room at the county family court was smaller than Marcus had expected, which somehow made everything worse. The press had filled every seat in the gallery, and the overflow stood in the hallway with the door propped open. Preston Holloway sat at the opposing table in a charcoal suit, flanked by 3 attorneys and a paralegal. With Brett beside him in the cervical collar Marcus now understood had never been medically prescribed. Marcus sat across from them with Dana on his left and a yellow legal pad in front of him he hadn't written a word on. He kept his hands flat on the table, pressing his palms into the surface, the way a person steadies himself against something solid when the ground feels uncertain. Preston's lead attorney opened with the edited video, projected on a screen mounted beside the judge's bench. 32 seconds of Marcus controlling 5 people, scrubbed of everything that came before it. The attorney walked through Marcus's competitive record in detail. The 29 wins, the submission victories, the regional title, and framed each fact not as evidence of discipline, but as proof of a capacity for harm. He argued that a man with Marcus's training could not claim the same standard of proportional force as an ordinary citizen, because his knowledge and physical capability turned every encounter into something categorically more dangerous. Brett's attorney added that Zoe had been knowingly brought to a location where her father had reason to expect a confrontation, and that this alone revealed a pattern of judgment that endangered her. Marcus looked at the blank legal pad. He thought about the 3 sentences on his kitchen counter. He thought about Zoe in the beige conference room, asking whether he had fought those people because he was angry. He picked up the pen, wrote nothing, and set it back down. Dana Vale stood. She said she had 3 pieces of evidence the court needed to review before any further argument proceeded, and asked permission to approach. Judge Carol Merrick, a measured woman who had said very little since the session opened, nodded once. Dana set a laptop on the evidence table, connected it to the room's display, and slid the memory card into the drive. The footage from Zoe's wildlife camera was wide-angle and slightly overexposed in the afternoon light, the way outdoor cameras always are when nobody designed them with human subjects in mind. But it was clear. It was unambiguous. It showed everything, from the moment Brett's group converged on the bench, the deliberate positioning, Travis and Evan raising their phones before anything happened, Cole moving to stand between Zoe and the nearest exit. It showed Brett lift the backpack from her shoulder. It showed Cole hold the blue inhaler up and examine it while Zoe's posture changed, her chest visibly tightening, her hand reaching toward him. It showed Marcus with both palms open and raised. It showed Zoe sit down on the grass because standing had become too much effort. And it showed the moment Brett stepped forward and threw the first punch. The courtroom went silent in the way large rooms go silent when everyone in them is suddenly paying the same quality of attention to the same thing. Preston's lead attorney raised a hand to speak, and Judge Merrick lifted one finger without looking at him, and he sat back down. The footage kept running. It showed Marcus moving through the next 45 seconds without a single offensive strike. Every technique redirectional. Every person who ended up on the ground had been traveling toward him when he got there. And the instant Cole went down and the inhaler hit the grass, Marcus stopped completely. He didn't glance at the others. He crossed directly to the inhaler, picked it up, and went to his daughter. Dana stopped the playback and let the room sit with what it had just seen. Then she moved to the audio. The jacket camera's visual feed had been ruined the moment Marcus hit the bench. The lens had shifted against the lining and recorded nothing but fabric. But the microphone, mounted higher, had captured everything. Dana played the relevant section without comment. Brett's voice came through first, unmistakable, telling Marcus to hit him, telling him his father would have Zoe taken before sundown. Then Marcus's voice, flat and focused, saying his daughter couldn't breathe and asking for the medication back. Brett's attorney objected to the relevance of the audio, and Judge Merrick overruled him before he finished the sentence. The third piece of evidence came from a direction no one at the opposing table had anticipated. Noah had not looked at Marcus once during the entire session. He'd been sitting at the far end of the opposing bench in a way that suggested he was trying to take up as little physical space as a person could. And somewhere during the playback of the wildlife footage, he had folded his hands in his lap and kept them there. When Dana announced that a third party had voluntarily surrendered a device containing communications between the 5 individuals involved, Preston's lead attorney rose sharply and began talking about chain of custody and admissibility. Judge Merrick let Dana continue. Noah had handed over his phone the previous evening at Dana's office, guided there by the slow, growing understanding that an 8-year-old girl might lose her father because Noah had been too afraid, for too long, to be the one in that group who finally said enough. The messages filled the screen in sequence. Brett's planning was detailed in the way people are detailed when they believe themselves untouchable. Dates, assignments, specific instructions about camera angles. A reminder to Travis to start recording before anything physical happened. There was a message about the Child Protective Services report, sent the night before the encounter, with a note that the groundwork was already laid. And near the bottom of the thread, sent the morning of that Tuesday, a message from Brett to the group: "We don't need to beat him. We just need to make him look like a monster in front of his kid." Dana read it aloud, then closed the laptop. She looked across the table at Preston Holloway and told the room, in the measured tone of someone choosing precision over drama, that the opposing party had not simply attacked a man in a public park. They had used a child with a respiratory condition as the mechanism of a premeditated trap, engineered specifically to destroy her father's life by exploiting his love for her. Judge Merrick called a brief recess. When she returned, she denied the motion to remove Zoe from Marcus's custody, effective immediately, and ordered the girl returned to her father's care before the close of business that day. The criminal assault charges against Marcus were formally dropped within the week, after an independent martial arts analyst reviewed the unedited footage and submitted a written assessment to the court. The analyst noted, with the precision of someone whose entire professional life is the study of how bodies move under pressure, that Marcus Reed had held the positional advantage and the technical knowledge to cause serious injury to any or all 5 individuals at multiple points during the encounter, and had not done so. He had used the minimum effective force at each moment and disengaged the instant the threat was neutralized. What was notable, the analyst concluded, was not that Marcus had been capable of defeating 5 people. It was that his capability and his restraint had existed in the same instant, and the restraint had won. An old clip surfaced during the news cycle that followed, footage from after a regional title defense more than a decade earlier. Marcus, younger and quieter on camera, telling an interviewer that a fighter who loses control hasn't become dangerous. He's just become afraid. The clip traveled widely enough that it became shorthand for the whole story. People who had never heard of Cedar Hollow shared it with captions about the difference between strength and character. The outlets that had first described Marcus as a volatile man with a history of violence issued corrections. The garage owner called him personally to apologize and asked him to come back whenever he was ready. Marcus said he'd be in Monday morning. Brett Holloway and the others faced a consolidated set of charges: criminal conspiracy, reckless endangerment of a minor, assault, evidence tampering, and filing a false report with a government agency. Noah's attorney negotiated a reduced arrangement in exchange for his cooperation, which the court accepted. Preston Holloway's legal exposure was more complicated and therefore moved more slowly. But the combination of Dana's civil filings and a separate investigation opened by the County Ethics Board ensured that it moved at all. A financial audit of Holloway Development turned up significant discrepancies between the environmental impact reports submitted to the council and the actual survey data the company had quietly commissioned. The condominium project was suspended pending review, and the suspension became indefinite when 3 members of the council publicly withdrew their prior support. Cedar Hollow Park stayed. The community garden stayed. At a small ceremony the following spring, the city placed a new marker near the climbing roses on the far side of the pond, a proper engraved stone with Nicole Reed's name and the years she had lived, and beneath that, a single line the garden committee had agreed on immediately: "She planted things here that still grow." Marcus stood at the stone for a long time the day it was unveiled. Zoe stood beside him and didn't say anything. After a while, she took his hand. The settlement from the civil suit came through 4 months after the hearing. Marcus paid off the remainder of the garage loan and set aside a portion for Zoe's education. With the rest, he rented a room in the community center 2 blocks from the park and opened a program he called the Anchor Project, which met on Saturday mornings and cost nothing to attend. The program did not teach people to fight. That was the first thing Marcus said at every single session, and he meant it exactly. What it taught was how to recognize when a situation was turning dangerous before it turned dangerous, how to document what was happening in ways that would actually hold up, how to de-escalate when the other person wanted the opposite, and how to stay standing inside your own values when someone was working very hard to make you abandon them. Dana Vale donated 2 hours a month. Marcus ran the rest himself, in plain language, without ever needing to perform his expertise. On the wall near the door, he hung his championship belt in a simple frame, not at the center, not in the most prominent spot, but visible. Below it was a photograph taken outside the courthouse on the day of the hearing. Zoe running across the courtyard toward him, arms out, and Marcus crouching to meet her at exactly her height. The belt and the photograph shared the wall, and anyone who looked at them long enough could work out for themselves which of the two meant more. On the first Tuesday after the program opened, Marcus and Zoe went back to Cedar Hollow Park. The construction fencing was gone. The pond was exactly as they'd left it. The same families of mallards, the same territorial goose that had always chased joggers along the east path, the same oak with the camera mount still fixed to its trunk. Zoe had a new notebook, the same kind as the old one. She crouched near the water and started her count. Marcus sat on the bench and watched her. After a while, without looking up from her notebook, Zoe asked him if he remembered what it felt like to be a champion. Marcus looked at her, at the top of her head bent toward the water, at the way she held her pen with 3 fingers instead of 2, at the patience she had built for watching things that moved slowly. And he told her that the day he won the belt, he had won one fight. He told her that the day he brought her home, he finally understood what winning actually was. Zoe wrote something in her notebook. A duck slid across the surface of the water, leaving a long, clean line behind it that slowly closed back into stillness. Marcus leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and the park held both of them in the particular quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in a place that had managed, against considerable effort, to remain exactly what it was. A strong man is not someone who never feels afraid. He is someone who stands inside the fear, inside the anger, inside the injustice, and still chooses to act for the people he loves rather than for himself. Marcus Reed didn't walk out of that park a champion because of what he knew how to do with his hands. He walked out a champion because when everything around him was engineered to turn him into something ugly, he refused. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because people like Marcus are more common than we think, and they deserve to be seen.